Sean Hook's Newsmaker Saturday starts now.
To say that our next guest's opinions caught my eye would be a colossal understatement. His recent article about Russia's invasion of Ukraine begins with the provocative statement, "How did we just kill 1 billion people?" He's talking about nuclear war with Russia, triggered by exactly the kind of situation that's unfolding 6,000 miles away. Harry Kazianis is a director of defense studies at the Center of National Interest in Washington, D.C. He's our guest on Newsmaker Saturday. Mr. Kazianis, thank you so much for being with us.
Hey, John, thanks for having me.
I appreciate this. You have war-gamed almost this exact situation. What happens?
Well, I mean, in every scenario we've ever run over the last 4 to 5 years, there's one definitive conclusion. Anytime the United States or NATO gets into any sort of conflict with Russia, there's essentially a 100% chance that ends up becoming a nuclear war. The reason's actually very simple. While the Russians have a very powerful military, they've rebuilt it over the last 20 years thanks to high oil revenues, they are not able to beat NATO in any sort of conventional military scenario. In other words, not using nuclear weapons or biological weapons or chemical weapons. But very early in any sort of conflict between those two powers, the Russians always end up using smaller tactical nuclear weapons to try to gain an advantage. What ends up happening is NATO responds with bigger weapons. As you can imagine, that continues to escalate where cities like New York, Washington, or maybe even Phoenix are destroyed. And that's how we get to 1 billion people dying.
So limited nuclear weapons, or tactical nuclear weapons as you call them, if Putin were to deploy those on a limited battlefield scale, even though the effect would be widespread from fallout as well, is that the same as nuclear war?
It is. Nuclear war is nuclear war, whether it's small nuclear war or big nuclear war. And the reasons are obvious. I mean, what the Russians would use would be small weapons, something that could kill, like, you can imagine a brigade or a division or something like that. It would still kill thousands of people, but that radioactivity would spread. I mean, imagine if, God forbid, that nuclear weapon went off near a stream or a river, or the wind blew in a certain way where it went towards a major metropolitan area. It doesn't have to be a big city killer nuclear weapon, you know, the ones we see in like the Terminator movies or something like that. But the real challenge is that the way nuclear doctrine and strategy works is that your adversary that you nuked will have to respond back with nuclear weapons. And what that means is you have to respond with more nuclear weapons and bigger nuclear weapons. And this is really the danger of nuclear war. Once you start it, it's very hard to shut it off.
This is a problem because Putin is using the nuclear threat as the sword of Damocles. He's hanging over us. He knows that we don't want to go there. We're not so sure he doesn't want to go there, but we think he doesn't. So now we're in this situation where apparently when you have war-gamed this, every time he gets backed into a corner, this is his play, nuclear.
Yeah, I mean, in all these scenarios we've done, we've always had sort of the hypothesis that there's an accident that triggers the war, that neither side starts shooting at one another, right? I mean, irregardless of the politics are involved, irregardless of the nasty things Vladimir Putin has done in Ukraine, he doesn't want to tangle with NATO. We don't want to tangle with Russia. But what always ends up starting the conflict is some freak black swan accident. In a lot of the scenarios we game out, a missile, an errant missile from Russia that's attacking Ukraine or the Baltics in a lot of scenarios flies into Poland or it flies into another NATO member. And while that hasn't happened in Ukraine, the Russians have attacked bases that are only 15 miles away from the Polish border. And you have to keep in mind what Joe Biden has said time and time again. We will defend every inch of NATO territory. That's his go-to line. And that means if Russia even accidentally attacks NATO, there is the possibility that NATO would respond. Maybe not with a missile, but maybe a cyber attack or something like that to show the Russians we mean business. And that's what sets off the chain reaction of a war that, again, would just be very, very hard to stop and where millions of people could potentially die. So that's the stakes in Ukraine.
Okay, to do this, you have to get in the mind of Vladimir Putin. To war game this, you have to know your adversary and climb into their brain. Maybe you understand him better than a lot of our folks do. I don't know. But can you tell me a little bit about kind of what drives him? I
think what drives Putin is one thing, power, and power more than anything else. Vladimir Putin has stated very unequivocally that he is very angry that the Soviet Union collapsed. He's stated it time and time again. He considers it the greatest geopolitical tragedy in modern history. I mean, if you do look at it from a very objective perspective, if you're Russian, you'd agree with him. I mean, the Russian Empire, the Russian state has lost territories that it held going back to the 1700s. So the Russians are, as a people, when they look at geopolitics, very upset. They feel like their day in the sun is gone. And in a lot of respects, Vladimir Putin and those who support Vladimir Putin are trying to get that back. The problem is for Vladimir Putin, he's working with an economy in a country that is in a very, very large-scale decline that's been happening since the 1970s. I mean, the Russian economy is actually the size of South Korea. I mean, that's how much they've actually contracted. So for Putin, his goal is really pretty simple. It's to try to make Russia great again in a lot of ways. And he's using this war in Ukraine and other wars he's launched in, whether it's Chechnya, whether it's against Georgia, whether it's against cleaving off parts of Crimea, to try and bring back that Russian empire, if you will, or the old Soviet Union. And so far, I mean, he's been able to do it, but the Russian economy and the Russian people are the ones who paid the price.
Is the only way out for him to go from within? In other words, some kind of corrosion from within, either with his defense folks or the public at large. Is that the only way out of this?
You know, I think that's a very natural question to ask. And you have a lot of people that are on the conservative side, Sean Hannity, different U.S. senators who've sort of, talked about this approach. Look, in a perfect world, I'd agree with them, to be honest with you. That seems like the smart idea. Get rid of Putin, assassinate him, and all the problems go away. The challenge is you don't know who's going to come after Vladimir Putin. I mean, there is Alexei Navalny, the great, democratic rights leader in Russia, who seems like he could be one to take over as president. But how do you do that? I mean, do you break him out of jail? I mean, how do you actually facilitate all that? And you have to keep in mind, too, when you launch some sort of coup, I mean, coups happen all over the world, and the history shows they don't always have the best results. But there's never been a coup on a country that's a nuclear superpower. I mean, how do you secure the nuclear weapons? How do you make sure that, all the submarine commanders that have nuclear weapons under the world's oceans that are part of the Russian Navy would be part of that? How do you know that somebody doesn't go rogue and launch some sort of attack? So it sounds great, get rid of Putin, all the problems are solved, but it opens what could be a nuclear Pandora's box. So I hate to say it, there's really no perfect solution here, to be honest with you.
If you had the president's ear right now, what would you tell him would be the best path forward? Because he's getting it from both sides. People who think we're too hawkish on it, others who say we're not doing enough. People want no-fly zones. That seems to be an act of war. That might invite the very scenario you're talking about. How far do we go, and has he gone far enough, and what would you tell him?
I think what Joe Biden needs to do is be completely pragmatic in this situation, and he needs to look at history. I think the Cuban Missile Crisis, while not exactly the same scenario, offers some lessons on what to do when you get to this sort of situation when you have two nuclear superpowers butting heads and neither side wants to back off. I think what Joe Biden should do is he should try to pick up the phone and try to call Vladimir Putin. Now, I know a lot of people are not going to like that. What it amounts to is talking to what is a war criminal. But in geopolitics, you don't get to choose who your adversaries are. You have to deal with the hand that you are dealt. So I think it would be smart for Biden to call him, try to get a sense of what his rationality is, what the sort of deal Putin might be thinking about, or if he's even willing to take any sort of deal, and see what off-ramps are out there. Because in all the scenarios I've ever wargamed when it comes to a U.S.-Russia war, things fall apart when neither sides are talking to one another, when both sides have to guess each other's intent. And you don't want to do that in a situation. You want both sides to sort of try to drop some of the rhetoric and start talking about what the solutions could look like. I have a feeling what the solution is going to end up being, that essentially is a massive frozen conflict that the Russians seem to be good at in all the areas that they fought in. So no peace treaty, no big signing at the UN in New York or something like that, where the Russians go home or the Ukrainians give up territory, but essentially both sides agreeing that things stay where they are, and you essentially have a slow brimmer, conflict that just sort of goes on and on for years. I mean, that's what's happened in
Afghanistan would come to mind. Afghanistan
Yeah.
would come to mind.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Absolutely.
so there are reports circulating that Biden is pressuring Zelensky to step aside. that if he walks away, Putin gets a puppet government in there in Ukraine, and he pretty much has what he wants without all the carnage. Well, at least in the interim. Is that a possibility? Does that sound rational to you, that Biden would be telling Zelensky, maybe you need to figure out an exit to get out of there?
I don't think so. I mean, that would be the equivalent of Winston Churchill walking out on the British people in 1940. I mean, Vladimir Zelensky is now a symbol of this conflict and a symbol of battling back against Russian aggression. I don't think there's any way that he would take that deal. I think the Ukrainian people would be enraged over something like that. And I think the amount of international condemnation that would be thrown at the West about abandoning an almost ally at this point in Ukraine would be a tragic mistake. And I think it would only embolden Vladimir Putin, even though he's greatly weakened over everything that's happened over Ukraine. I mean, what would stop him from saying, you know what, if the West is going to be this weak on Ukraine and they throw away their almost ally now, why don't I just try for the Baltics? Why don't I try for Moldova? Why don't I think about cleaving off parts of Poland? So this is one of those times where we have to stay strong. And the Ukrainians have held their own on the battlefield. They've done an incredible job.
Well, and that's one of the surprises of all this. It maybe has exposed Russia as a bit of a paper tiger, at least in the conventional sense. It's been lackluster. A lot of it has not been very good. It seems haphazard, and now they're kind of resorting to attacking civilian targets. The rest of the world is watching this, and I think about the nuclear actors, Pakistan, India, Iran, soon to be, North Korea. If they see the kind of power that Putin is wielding just with the threat of this completely explains why they want nuclear weapons, right? I mean, it is the ultimate bargaining chip.
It's the ultimate bargaining chip, and it also freezes the United States from being able to do things like regime change. I mean, let's face it, look at the history. The United States doesn't undergo operations to try to throw out a leader if you have nuclear weapons or chemical weapons or biological weapons. The countries that the United States has decided to launch military operations on don't have those weapons. So if you're North Korea or Iran, North Korea specifically, you want to keep those nuclear weapons. You're not giving them up. And if you're Iran, regardless of whatever deal happens over the next few weeks, you're still thinking long-term about getting nuclear weapons or getting so close to having the technology to make sure you can get them in a hurry if you have to.
The thing that's so worrisome is that once something is constructed, it eventually seems that it will be used at some point. We've got nuclear weapons. We're now awash in them. Do you see that you can keep this genie in the bottle, that somebody at some point is not going to launch?
This is the thing that keeps me up at night. I mean, the challenge is you're absolutely right. These weapons, they do have a propensity to want to be used. I mean, especially if you're somebody like Russia, who thinks they can give you a tactical advantage when your conventional forces can't meet the muster when it comes to NATO. I think you have to think of it this way. I think nuclear weapons will continue to spread, unfortunately. I mean, let's face it, the first nuclear detonation was in 1945. This is a new technology. So I think there is, sadly, the possibility these weapons could be used, but maybe not on the battlefield. I wouldn't be shocked if someday a terrorist used them in some sort of nuclear 9/11. But I think this is also why we have to really clamp down on countries like North Korea, for example, and make sure they can't sell that technology. Because if we can sort of slow the spread, and I hate to use that term, but it's the only one that fits, and at least be able to slow this down and try to control it as best we can.
Couple more things. Do you think we have some back channels with Putin's intimates? In other words, would we be able to convince them to slow roll this or not do anything if Putin were to order a launch? Do you think there'd be people, cooler heads would prevail and they'd say, I know he's telling me to do this, but I'm not doing it?
I think absolutely. I think the U.S. government always has probably sympathetic ears definitely in the Kremlin, or at least in the Russian military, talking to them, letting them know what our red lines are, things that we could not accept, especially nuclear weapons use or chemical or biological weapons use. And I think the Biden administration, despite many faults, I think has done a good job to try and communicate that. And I think they've also done a really good job at putting out any sort of plans that the Russians have in terms of launching attacks, almost using information warfare against the Russians. But I do think we are talking to a lot of different actors there to make sure that this doesn't spiral out of control.
One more thing. I think Americans, people watching this program, they wonder what would this look like if there really were a nuclear conflict. Can you describe in your war games what would happen to the United States? What would the targets, be?
But
I know. What would this look like?
Well, if it was a full-blown nuclear attack and most U.S. major cities were destroyed, what would happen is radiation would spread throughout the country. Food supplies would disappear. There could be something called a nuclear winter where essentially the atmosphere would clog with radioactive dust that there'd be no sun anymore. If there's no sun, there's no agriculture, no food. That could persist for 1 to 2 years. Cancer would be widespread. A huge chunk of the American population would die, and who would be left would be disfigured, disformed, have genetic damage. Their children would carry that genetic damage. I guess the best way to put it is hell would become Earth. And that would be the most terrifying scenario I can think of. And it's why it is so important that the United States tries to find a solution to this. That's not weakness. That's not appeasement. That's just reality.
Do you think we're approaching this the right way at this point?
I think so, but I do think it's important for Joe Biden to try to reach out to the Russians at this point. I think Vladimir Putin feels like he's boxed in. I think he knows he's made an absolutely terrible miscalculation invading Ukraine. He knows his forces can't win. I mean, they don't have the food, the fuel, the ammunition, the military capabilities to conquer that country and hold it for years. So I think it's up to Joe Biden to try to make that first contact, try to see where the Russian leader's head's at, and then try to figure a way out of it. Even if it's imperfect, even if that means a frozen conflict and another one in Europe, I think that's certainly better than full-blown nuclear war.
Afghanistan weakened the Soviet Union. So my question is, in some perverse way, does the Ukrainian conflict weaken Russia?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the amount of sanctions that Russia has been hit with, I don't even think we have come to fathom yet. I talked to one very, very senior Wall Street official at a major bank, and he told me Russia has been hit with about $2.5 trillion in total economic damage that will hit them this year. The Russian economy is only worth about $1.3 trillion. So they're in depression right now. The Russian state is teetering, and you could see it be on some edge of, in terms of collapse by the end of the year. And that's scary. In you thinking about how they have nuclear weapons and they have to make sure those nuclear weapons are secure. You don't want to get into a situation where Russia is a failed state. So my hope is that Vladimir Putin understands this and tries to figure a way out, and we figure a way to do this where all sides get to save face and no more people have to die.
Harry Kazianis, Director of Defense Studies at the National Center of Interest, Center for National Interest in Washington, D.C. Pretty unpleasant stuff on a Saturday night for a lot of people, but I appreciate you spending some time with us.
Thanks for having me.
Great to see you. Thank you. We're back in a minute on Newsmaker Saturday. Back on Newsmaker Saturday, this week, Governor Ducey with quite an admission that the COVID crisis in Arizona is over. And part of his agreement on that whole move was made with the former Surgeon General, Richard Carmona, who's his advisor on COVID matters. So the worst of it is apparently over, at least according to the governor. Let's check in with Will Humble, who's been great to us here on the program, the former state health director. Will, thank you for being with us. Was that a wise move by the governor, do you think, to say, okay, I think the crisis is over?
Well, I mean, yes, but here's the thing. Those emergency declarations are really only valuable in that it gives the governor, or in the case of the president, additional executive authority that he or she doesn't normally have. And so if you look at the executive order establishing the emergency in Arizona, and then take a look at what the governor has been doing or not doing with that authority, I go back 14 months and say he really hasn't used that executive authority for anything useful. If anything, he's used some of that authority for harmful purposes last summer. So ending the emergency doesn't really do anything except take additional authority away from himself that he wasn't really using.
Well, you know, this has been the debate. I think the governor is he's leaned more on a light touch of government for the most part in matters COVID. Other states went hard, like California. But you compare California to Florida, for instance, and if you factor in age disparity, because Florida is a much older state, the outcomes weren't significantly different with either state.
Well, I paid more attention to Arizona, and I could tell you what the statistics are in Arizona, even after age adjustment. We're second worst in the United States in deaths per capita, right behind Mississippi, and that's after age adjusting. We've got, if you look at the 2 years of the pandemic and you look at all-cause mortality, not just COVID, but all-cause mortality, Arizona is by far the worst. It's quite a margin between Arizona and Texas looking at all-cause mortality. And so what you bring up is an important point, that age has always been a factor during this pandemic, but the policies that governors choose to implement also is a very big factor. And I would argue that the policy decisions made by the governor are a bigger reason why Arizona was among the worst in the country rather than demographics. It just does. Oh, another thing about that, John, look at the demographics of Arizona. A lot of people think we're an older state. Arizona's median age is 38 years old.
That's right.
The United States median age is 38 years old. We are average.
We're right there. Yeah. All right, let's check in with your take on the new variant, the BA2. What do we know? It sounds like it's pretty contagious, but no worse than any other variant. And it looks like the vaccines and natural immunity probably work pretty well against it. Is that your take?
Yeah, I can't add anything to that you're right on target.
Okay, so in Arizona, let's look at the whole breadth of this pandemic. Do we know now, between people vaccinated and how many got this virus, how many people had COVID, either the old-fashioned way, catching it, or getting a vaccine?
No, we don't know those numbers. The health department has those numbers. They haven't established how much breakthrough existed. I mean, they have a registry of everybody that got vaccinated in the state. They also have the case reporting that shows who got the vaccine, or who was infected with COVID, at least that was reported. And they could actually do a report that showed us that, but I haven't seen anything published from them.
I would love to see that, because I think throughout this entire episode, natural immunity was really underplayed. Am I wrong?
No, you're right about that. And there's some studies out of Israel and other countries that have shown that an infection with the virus provides better, longer lasting immunity than the vaccine itself. Now, I'm not saying you should get infected, but I will say among this whole, the luckiest part of this pandemic, really, quite honestly, John, was that the Omicron variant was so much less lethal than Delta. If Omicron had been as contagious if Omicron had been as contagious as it is and was as lethal as Delta, this would have been apocalyptic over the last few months.
Yeah.
But we're just fortunate that it was much less lethal than the Delta variant, and which made it such that it didn't cause a huge problem in December and January a couple of months ago.
Will, I want to give you a minute here to discuss what we've learned. What has public health learned? If we ever were to face this again, and we will no doubt in our future, something else will come along, what would we not do again that we did this time? Or what should we do that we didn't do?
Well, I think overarching, we should rely more on evidence as we make decisions. One of the early things that we learned back in June of 2020 was how profoundly useful masks would be at slowing the spread of this virus, especially. It was the number one thing we had up until the vaccine. So using evidence and data at the national and at the state level by policymakers, mostly governors and presidents, to make evidence-based decisions. I think that was one of the fall downs of this pandemic. On the other hand, one of the things we learned is that research in journals, that's what's called preprint, in other words, that is before the peer review process,
Yes.
is actually pretty reliable. I mean, the stuff that we learned through these preprint journal publications was pretty much square on. And so one of the things we learned is you don't have to really wait for something to be officially and finally peer reviewed to look at it and start making decisions with it.
That's really interesting. Will, we appreciate your time. Thank you again. And it feels like we're in a pretty good place, but keep your fingers crossed, right?
No, I think we are. We did. The first one of these was about 2 years ago
I
today.
know. And we thank you, Will. Thank you. Will
All right, take
Humble,
care.
former state health director. We're back in a minute on Newsmaker Saturday.